The Japanese bunker had been killing Americans for 3 days. 17 men were dead. 23 more were wounded. The position was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, built into the root system of a massive banyan tree with firing slits cut at ground level. Machine gun fire swept the approach from 3 directions. Mortars zeroed on every piece of cover. The logs that formed the bunker walls were 2 feet thick, soaked with moisture from the tropical rain. They absorbed rifle rounds like sponges absorbing water. Lieutenant Coleman had tried everything. His men had crawled through the mud with demolition charges and been cut down before they got within throwing range. They had called for tanks and watched a Sherman take 3 direct hits from a hidden anti-tank gun before reversing out of the kill zone with flames licking from its engine deck. They had requested naval gunfire support and been told the coordinates were too close to friendly positions. The assault had stalled. The timeline had collapsed, and somewhere in the rear echelon, eating hot food and sleeping on cots, were the men who the infantry hated most. The anti-aircraft crews. Those rear echelon commandos, Corporal Davis spat, wiping mud from his face. Sitting on the beach shooting at planes that don't exist while we die in this stinking jungle. He wasn't wrong about the planes. The Japanese Air Force had been swept from the Pacific skies months ago. The anti-aircraft batteries that had been shipped to the island at enormous expense sat idle, their crews playing cards and writing letters home, while the infantry bled and died a few miles inland. But one of those crews was listening to the radio traffic, and what they heard made them angrier than any Japanese bullet ever could. Staff Sergeant William Miller had been manning a Bofors 40 Meissonier anti-aircraft gun for 11 months. He had fired exactly 12 rounds in combat during that entire time, all of them at a reconnaissance plane that had been too high to hit anyway. The rest of his service had been an exercise in expensive futility. The Bofors was a magnificent weapon, a Swedish-designed precision instrument that could throw 2-pound explosive shells to an altitude of 23,000 feet with mechanical accuracy. It was also one of the most expensive weapons systems in the American arsenal. Each 40 mm round cost more than an infantry private earned in a month. The logistics officers tracked every shell with obsessive attention. Ammunition expenditure reports were filed in triplicate. Unauthorized firing was a court-martial offense. The weapon was too valuable to waste on targets that weren't aircraft. Miller had listened to this logic for almost a year. He had watched it while infantry units were torn apart by bunkers that his gun could have destroyed in seconds. He had filed requests for ground support missions and watched them disappear into the bureaucratic void. He had been called a rear-echelon commando so many times that he had stopped correcting people. But today, listening to Lieutenant Coleman's desperate radio calls for support that wasn't coming, something in Miller broke. "Get the tractor," he told his crew. "We're moving the gun." Private First Class Henderson looked at him like he had suggested they all commit suicide. "Sarge, that gun weighs 5,000 pounds. We'd need to drag it 3 miles through jungle. And even if we could, General Morrison specifically ordered all anti-aircraft assets to remain at the beach perimeter. He said using AA rounds for ground support was a criminal waste of government property. General Morrison isn't watching 17 of our boys get slaughtered by a bunker we could delete in 30 seconds. They'll court-martial you. They'll have to wait until I'm done." The Bofors 40 Minimus was never designed to be moved through jungle terrain. It was designed to be towed on roads by a dedicated artillery tractor, then emplaced in a prepared position with sandbag revetments and ammunition bunkers. The gun carriage had 4 wheels designed for flat surfaces. The barrel assembly weighed nearly a ton by itself. The whole system required a crew of 6 just to operate, let alone relocate. Miller's crew dragged it through the jungle anyway. They used a captured Japanese truck when the path was wide enough and pure muscle when it wasn't. They cut through vegetation with machetes. They corduroyed mud holes with palm logs. They pushed and pulled and cursed for 6 hours while the sun beat down and the sounds of gunfire echoed from the ridgeline ahead. When they finally reached Lieutenant Coleman's position, the infantry stared at them with expressions that mixed disbelief with desperate hope. "What the hell is that?" Coleman asked. "Bofors 40 Men," Miller replied, already directing his crew to unlimber the gun. "Anti-aircraft weapon. But today it's going to be an anti-bunker weapon. Can it penetrate those logs? Miller looked at the Japanese position, studying the firing slits, the angles, the construction. He had never fired at a ground target in his life. Everything he knew about the weapon said it was designed for completely different physics. Aircraft were thin-skinned aluminum. Bunkers were thick-walled fortifications. The engagement distances were different. The trajectories were different. The safety protocols were completely different. Only one way to find out, he said. The Bofors crew set up the gun 200 yards from the Japanese bunker. This was already criminally close for a weapon designed to engage targets at thousands of feet. But Miller knew that at this range, in this terrain, with the jungle canopy blocking any long-distance shooting, 200 yards might as well be point blank. The Japanese spotted them immediately. Rifle fire cracked from the tree line. A machine gun burst chewed the ground to Miller's left, throwing up dirt and vegetation. The thin gun shield that protected the crew was designed to stop aircraft strafing fire from above. It offered almost nothing against direct horizontal shooting. Miller ignored the incoming fire. He centered the crude iron sights on the main firing slit of the bunker and pressed the firing pedal. The Bofors spoke. It wasn't like the rhythmic thump of the 37 Minier or the roar of the Quad 50. The Bofors had its own voice. A sharp, percussive bark that repeated at 120 rounds per minute when the loader kept pace. Pop, 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 pop. Each report was accompanied by a visible streak as the tracer element in the shell drew a line of fire through the jungle air. The first shell struck the log wall 6 inches from the firing slit. The explosion was not what Miller expected. He had imagined penetration, the shell punching through and detonating inside. Instead, the 40 missamine high-explosive round detonated on contact with the surface. The blast didn't pierce the logs. It shattered them. The Swedish designers had built a shell optimized for fragmenting aircraft aluminum, and when that fragmentation effect hit saturated wood, it created something the crews would later call the shotgun effect. The log wall didn't develop a hole. It exploded outward. Splinters the size of bayonets sprayed in all directions. The Japanese machine gunner who had been firing through that slit was hit by fragments of his own fortification, torn apart by the bunker that was supposed to protect him. Miller fired again, and again, and again. Each shell removed another piece of the bunker. The 2-foot-thick logs that had stopped rifle rounds and shrugged off mortar fire were being systematically disassembled by explosions that turned the wood itself into shrapnel. The Japanese inside were being killed by their own construction materials. But the Japanese weren't the only ones in danger. The Bofors 40 Misamas was designed for sustained anti-aircraft fire, where the barrel had time to cool between engagements and the target was far enough away that the shells armed properly in flight. Miller was firing at point-blank range by artillery standards. The shells were barely traveling long enough to arm their fuses. Several rounds struck the bunker and failed to detonate, their mechanisms not yet activated by the required spin distance. And the barrel was heating up. Henderson, feeding clips into the magazine, noticed it first. The barrel jacket was changing color. The blued steel was shifting toward a dull red glow that was visible even in the tropical sunlight. Sarge, we're cooking. Miller knew what that meant. A cook-off occurred when the barrel temperature reached the point where ammunition would detonate simply from the heat, without the firing mechanism being activated. If a round cooked off while they were loading, the explosion would kill everyone within 20 feet. Keep firing, Miller shouted. We stop now, we die. They stop shooting, we live. It was insane logic, but it was the only logic that applied. They were committed. The Japanese knew their position. Retreating meant dragging a 5,000-pound gun through the jungle while taking fire from every surviving defender. Their only chance was to destroy the enemy faster than the enemy could destroy them. The bunker was collapsing. The banyan tree that had anchored the position was dying, its trunk shredded by repeated impacts. Flames were spreading through the destroyed timbers. Secondary explosions marked ammunition cooking off inside the ruined fortification. And then the Japanese counterattacked. They came out of the jungle to the east, a dozen soldiers screaming and charging with fixed bayonets. It wasn't a full banzai charge, but it was enough. If they reached the gun position, The crew would be slaughtered. Miller swung the Bofors. The gun wasn't designed for this kind of engagement. The traverse was slow. The sights were optimized for aerial tracking. But he had no choice. The 40 Mini shells designed to destroy aircraft began destroying human beings. Each round that struck a charging soldier didn't just kill him. It vaporized the center mass and left the extremities to fall separately. The men behind the initial targets were hit by fragments from the explosions. The charge collapsed in seconds, not because the survivors lost courage, but because there were no survivors. The barrel was glowing bright orange now. Miller could feel the heat on his face from 3 feet away. The paint on the gun shield was blistering. The wooden handles on the traverse wheel were smoking. "One more clip," he screamed. "Give me one more clip." Henderson slammed the final ammunition strip into the magazine. His hands were burned from touching the superheated metal. He didn't care. None of them cared. They were past the point of rational calculation. Miller emptied the last rounds into the bunker. The entire structure collapsed inward, timbers and earth and bodies folding into a crater of smoke and fire. The machine guns went silent. The rifle fire stopped. The position that had killed 17 Americans and wounded 23 more had been erased from the jungle. Miller released the firing pedal. The Bofors fell silent. The only sounds were the crackling of flames and the distant calls of birds startled by the sudden quiet. The barrel was warped. The heat had physically bent the precision-machined steel. The weapon would never fire again. They had destroyed a piece of equipment worth more than any of them would earn in their entire military careers. Miller didn't care. He looked at the ruins of the bunker and thought about the men who had died trying to take it with rifles and grenades. He thought about the tanks that had been damaged and the support requests that had been denied. He thought about General Morrison and his criminal waste of government property. The infantry emerged from their fighting positions and approached the gun crew with expressions of stunned reverence. Lieutenant Coleman stood beside the ruined Bofors and stared at Miller. "You just destroyed a $5,000 weapon. I just saved your platoon. General Morrison is going to have you shot. General Morrison can get in line." The court-martial paperwork was drawn up. The charges were serious. Destruction of government property, disobeying direct orders, unauthorized expenditure of rationed ammunition. Miller was looking at 5 to 10 years in military prison. The paperwork disappeared somewhere between the regimental headquarters and the divisional judge advocate. Nobody could quite explain what happened to it. The officers who had been so certain of the charges suddenly couldn't remember filing them. The witnesses who had been prepared to testify developed convenient amnesia. What did circulate were the after-action reports, the intelligence assessments, the casualty figures from similar bunker assaults that had been conducted without anti-aircraft support. The numbers were damning. Units that had access to Bofors guns repurposed for ground support were taking a third of the casualties of units that didn't. Within 6 months, the tactical doctrine had officially changed. Anti-aircraft weapons were authorized for ground support when air threats were minimal. The criminal waste of government property became standard operating procedure. The lessons learned on that unnamed ridge in the Pacific would echo through military history. When American forces found themselves fighting another jungle war in Vietnam 2 decades later, they brought a purpose-built weapon system that combined the Bofors concept with armored mobility. They called it the M42 Duster. It mounted twin 40 mm cannons on a tracked chassis and became one of the most devastating anti-personnel weapons of that conflict. The crews who operated the Dusters didn't know about Staff Sergeant Miller. They didn't know about the warped barrel and the court-martial paperwork that vanished. They didn't know that their weapon existed because a rear-echelon commando had dragged a 5,000-pound gun through the jungle and refused to let bureaucracy kill American soldiers. But they knew the sound. Pop, 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 pop. The voice of the Bofors. The sound that turned bunkers into kindling and charges into corpses. Some lessons have to be learned in blood before they can be written in manuals. Some innovations have to be proven in defiance before they can be approved in committees. And some weapons have to destroy themselves to prove what they're truly capable of. Miller finished the war as a technical sergeant. He never received a medal for what he did on that ridge. He never asked for one. When people thanked him for his service, he just nodded and changed the subject. The only award he kept was a twisted piece of steel from the Bofors barrel, warped by the heat of sustained firing. He kept it on his desk until the day he died. When his children asked about it, he would hold up the medal and smile. This is what happens when you care more about the mission than the manual. If Miller's story of defiance and innovation hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm that forgotten warriors who broke the rules to save lives deserve to be remembered. If you're not subscribed, fix that now, because next week we're uncovering another banned weapon that generals tried to bury. Drop a comment and answer honestly. If your barrel was glowing orange and enemy soldiers were charging your position, would you have kept firing or abandoned the gun? I want to know. I'll see you in the next one.